My grandfather used to say that the truth was never in a hurry. He said it the way he said most things, quietly, without looking up from whatever he was doing, as though the words were just an observation about weather rather than a lesson meant to last a lifetime. I was 11 years old the first time I heard him say it. I was 34 when I finally understood what he meant. My name is Celeste Abara. I grew up in a large house outside of Memphis, Tennessee, in a family that measured itself by what it owned and who it had once been. My grandfather, Celeste Abara, had built everything from nothing over 50 years. A transport and logistics business that employed 200 people at its peak. 3 commercial properties downtown. A farmhouse on 12 acres that had been in the family since before I was born. When he died on a Tuesday in November, the family gathered within 48 hours. Not to grieve exactly. To position. I noticed that difference immediately. I was the only one who cried at the airport. Celeste Abara had 5 surviving children. My father, Cornelius, was the eldest and had spent decades behaving as though that birth order was a form of ownership. Below him came my Aunt Vera, sharp and careful, who had moved to Atlanta 20 years ago and returned only when something required her attention. Then Uncle Pax, who was gentle and easily managed by whoever spoke to him last. Then Aunt Sola, who said little and observed everything. And finally Uncle Bryce, the youngest, who had borrowed money from the estate 3 times that I knew of and possibly more that I didn't. They all arrived at the Memphis house within 2 days of my grandfather's passing. The reading of the will was scheduled for the following Friday, 6 days away. 6 days in a large house with 5 adult children who each believed they deserved the largest share of a significant estate. The atmosphere was what you might expect. Warm on the surface. Calculated underneath. Meals were eaten together with the careful conversation of people who were really just waiting. I stayed in my grandfather's old study most evenings. It still smelled like him. Cedar and old paper and the particular sweetness of the hard candy he kept in a glass bowl on the corner of his desk. I sat in his chair and tried to feel close to him. On the 3rd evening I found something tucked beneath the desk blotter that made me sit very still for a long time. It was a photograph. Old and slightly faded at the edges the way photographs get when they have lived in the same spot for many years without being moved. It showed my grandfather standing outside the farmhouse, younger than I had ever known him, maybe 60, laughing at something outside the frame. Beside him stood a man I recognized immediately despite not having seen him in over 2 decades. His name was Kofi Mensah. He had been my grandfather's personal driver and household manager for nearly 15 years before my father fired him the summer I was 14. I remembered the firing clearly because it had confused me deeply at the time. Kofi had been a constant presence in my childhood. Reliable, warm, and possessed of the particular loyalty that some people give freely and cannot be manufactured or purchased. My father had let him go without explanation beyond a brief announcement at dinner that Kofi's services were no longer required. When I asked why, Cornelius looked at me with the expression he reserved for questions he considered beneath his dignity to answer. I had not thought about Kofi Mensah in years. Seeing his face in that photograph in my grandfather's study, tucked deliberately beneath the desk blotter where only someone sitting in that specific chair would find it, produced a feeling I could not immediately name. I turned the photograph over. On the back, in my grandfather's handwriting, were 4 words. Kofi knows the rest. I slipped the photograph into the pocket of my cardigan and sat very still in my grandfather's chair for a long time. The house was quiet around me. Through the study wall I could hear the distant sound of my father and Uncle Pax talking in the sitting room, their voices carrying the particular rhythm of people dividing something that did not yet officially belong to them. I turned the photograph over twice more as though the 4 words might rearrange themselves into something less significant if I looked long enough. They didn't. Kofi knows the rest. I thought about what that meant. My grandfather was a precise man. He chose words carefully and never used them decoratively. If he had written those 4 words on the back of a photograph and hidden it in a place only someone sitting in his chair would find, he had intended exactly that message for exactly that kind of moment. He had left me a direction. Not an explanation. A direction. I did not tell anyone about the photograph that evening. I went to dinner, passed the bread, answered questions about my drive from Nashville where I lived, and listened to my Uncle Bryce explain for the 3rd time why the farmhouse would be most sensibly managed by someone local. I kept my face completely neutral and my cardigan pocket close. After dinner I went upstairs and searched Kofi Mensah's name online for the first time in 20 years. It took me 11 minutes to find a phone number. I called the number from the bathroom with the door locked and the tap running quietly. An old habit from childhood in a house where privacy required engineering. The phone rang 4 times. I was preparing for voicemail when the line connected. Hello. The voice was older than I remembered, but the particular steadiness of it was exactly the same. Kofi Mensah had always spoken as though he had considered the conversation in advance and found it manageable. Mr. Mensah, I said. This is Celeste. Edison Abara's granddaughter. A pause. Not a surprised one. More like the pause of someone confirming something they had been expecting. Celeste, he said. I wondered which one of you would call. That sentence stopped me completely. You were expecting someone to call? Your grandfather told me someone would, he said simply. When the time came. I sat down on the edge of the bathtub. The tap kept running. He told you that? He told me several things, Kofi said. His voice was careful but not unkind. Some of them I can share with you now. Others need to wait for Friday. The reading of the will, I said. Yes, he said. I'll be there, Celeste. Your grandfather made sure of that. Another brief pause. He made sure of a great many things, actually. That was always his way. I looked at my reflection in the bathroom mirror. I looked like someone who had just understood that the story they thought they were living in was actually a different story entirely. Mr. Mensah, I said quietly. What did my father do? The pause that followed was the longest one yet. Kofi did not answer my question directly that night. He said some things needed to arrive in the right order and that patience was a form of respect for the truth. It sounded exactly like something my grandfather would have said, which told me how long those 2 men had been speaking the same language. Before he hung up, he said one thing that stayed with me through the remaining days in that house. Your grandfather never stopped trusting you, Celeste. Even when the people around him made that difficult. I turned that sentence over for 3 days. The rest of the week passed in the particular slow tension of a house full of people waiting for a document to tell them who they were. My father held informal meetings with Aunt Vera in the dining room with the door partially closed. Uncle Bryce made phone calls on the back porch that he ended abruptly whenever anyone came outside. Aunt Sola watched everything quietly from her usual corner chair and said almost nothing, which I had learned years ago meant she was thinking more carefully than anyone else in the room. I went through my grandfather's study each evening after everyone else had gone to bed. Not searching for anything specific. Just sitting with him in the only way still available. On Thursday night, I found his personal journal in the bottom drawer of the filing cabinet behind a hanging folder labeled miscellaneous. I read it until 3 a.m. By the time I closed it, I understood everything my father had done and exactly how long my grandfather had known. The journal covered 11 years. My grandfather wrote in it irregularly, sometimes 3 entries in a week and then nothing for 2 months. But when he wrote, he was precise and honest in the way that people are when they believe only their own eyes will read the words. The earliest relevant entries dated back 22 years. They described a pattern of behavior from my father that my grandfather had initially attributed to stress and later understood as something more deliberate. Cornelius had been systematically misrepresenting the financial state of the family business to Edison. Presenting altered profit summaries. Redirecting certain revenue streams through a secondary account my grandfather had not authorized. The amounts were significant. Over several years they were very significant. My grandfather had discovered the truth gradually and documented it carefully without confronting Cornelius directly. He wrote about his reasoning in an entry from 18 years ago. He said that confronting Cornelius openly would only drive the behavior underground where it would become harder to trace. He said he needed time to protect what he had built before he acted. Kofi had discovered the secondary account by accident during a routine errand and brought it to my grandfather quietly. That was why Cornelius had fired him. Not for any professional failure. Because Kofi had seen something Cornelius needed unseen. My grandfather wrote about that firing with a grief that moved through the page even 20 years later. I could not protect him then. I have made sure to protect him now. I closed the journal carefully and held it against my chest in the dark study. Friday was tomorrow. Friday morning arrived with the clean, quiet light of a November day that had decided to be beautiful despite its circumstances. I dressed carefully in a dark blue dress my grandfather had once said made me look like someone worth listening to. I put the journal in my bag. I put the photograph in my jacket pocket where I could feel it against my ribs. Breakfast was a tense and careful affair. My father sat at the head of the table in the chair that had been my grandfather's and poured coffee with the settled authority of a man who had already decided how the day would end. Aunt Vera picked at toast and checked her phone. Uncle Bryce ate with the focused energy of someone burning nervous calories. Aunt Sola drank tea and watched the window. Nobody mentioned Kofi Mensah. Nobody knew to. The reading was scheduled for 10 a.m. at the offices of my grandfather's attorney, a composed and unhurried man named Walter Obi who had handled Edison Abara's legal affairs for over 25 years. His office was on the 4th floor of a building downtown, paneled in dark wood with photographs of Memphis on every wall. We arrived together in 2 cars. My father led the way into the elevator with the stride of a man walking toward something already settled. I followed last and said nothing during the ride up. Walter Obi was waiting when we entered. He shook each hand with equal warmth and no particular preference. He gestured toward the long conference table and asked everyone to be seated. He placed a pale blue folder on the table in front of him. He had not yet opened it when I heard the door behind us open quietly. I turned around first. I am not sure why. Perhaps because I had been expecting it and my body knew before my mind confirmed it. Kofi Mensah stood in the doorway of Walter Obi's conference room looking exactly as I had imagined he might. Older in the specific way that dignified people age, the lines deeper, the hair fully gray, but the posture the same and the eyes carrying the same steady quality I remembered from childhood. He wore a dark suit and held a document folder against his side with the careful grip of someone transporting something important. The room reacted in layers. Walter Obi looked up without surprise, which told me he had been expecting this too. Aunt Sola turned and went very still in the particular way she did when something confirmed what she had already suspected. Aunt Vera frowned slightly. Uncle Pax looked confused. Uncle Bryce looked at his phone. My father's reaction was different from all of theirs. Cornelius turned slowly, the way people turn when part of them already knows what they will see and is buying time before the seeing becomes official. When his eyes landed on Kofi, the color in his face changed in a way that had nothing to do with surprise and everything to do with the specific fear of a person watching something they buried a long time ago walk calmly back into the light. Walter Obi stood. "Thank you for coming, Mr. Mensah," he said. "Please take a seat." Kofi nodded once and sat at the far end of the table directly across from my father. He placed the document folder on the table in front of him without opening it. The room was completely silent. Walter Obi opened the reading with the measured formality of someone who understood that the next hour required a steady hand at the front of the room. He confirmed the full name of the deceased, the date of death, and the legal validity of the document before him. He explained the process clearly and asked that all questions be held until he had completed the reading. My father sat with his hands flat on the table. A posture I recognized. It was the one he used when he was managing something internally while maintaining an external appearance of calm. Walter began reading. The early sections covered expected provisions. Charitable donations to 2 organizations my grandfather had supported for decades. Personal items distributed among family members with the specific thoughtfulness of a man who had paid attention to what each person actually valued rather than what they performed valuing. My grandfather left me his personal journal collection and his study desk. I heard my father exhale very quietly beside me. Then Walter reached the section covering the primary estate assets. The commercial properties. The business interests. The farmhouse and its 12 acres. He paused before beginning this section in a way that was brief but noticeable. The particular pause of a person about to read something they know will change the atmosphere of a room. Before I continue, Walter said, I am required to ask whether anyone present wishes to raise an objection or submit additional documentation relevant to the disposition of the primary estate. The room was silent for 3 full seconds. Then Kofi Mensah opened his document folder and placed a stapled set of papers on the table in front of him. I do, he said quietly. My father's hands came off the table. That small movement told me everything about what the next few minutes were going to reveal. Walter Obi nodded at Kofi with the composure of a man who had coordinated this moment in advance. Mr. Mensah, he said. Please present your documentation. Kofi slid the stapled papers toward Walter across the table. Walter received them without looking at my father and began reading from the top page in silence for a moment before speaking. "This," Walter said, "is a codicil to Edison Abara's will." A codicil is a legally binding amendment that modifies or adds to the provisions of an existing will. He looked around the table. This codicil was drafted 7 years ago, witnessed by 2 independent parties, and notarized by a certified legal official. It is fully valid under Tennessee estate law. Aunt Vera set down her pen. Uncle Pax looked at Uncle Bryce. Aunt Sola did not move at all. My father spoke for the first time since Kofi had entered the room. His voice was controlled but only just. "Where did that document come from?" he asked. Walter looked at him steadily. "It was entrusted to Mr. Mensah by your father for safekeeping 7 years ago," he said. Edison Abara made that arrangement deliberately and documented his reasoning in an accompanying letter which I will also read into the record this morning. Cornelius opened his mouth and then closed it again. Walter placed the codicil flat on the table and smoothed the top page with one careful hand. "I'll read it in full," he said. Walter read slowly and without editorial comment, which was exactly right. The codicil did not need interpretation. My grandfather had written it in plain language with the deliberate clarity of a man who wanted no room for misreading. The document began by referencing what Edison described as a sustained pattern of financial misrepresentation conducted by his eldest son Cornelius Abara over a period of no less than 14 years. It named the secondary account. It listed specific amounts and specific years. It referenced documentation that had been preserved and filed separately with Walter Obie's office in a sealed record. The room temperature seemed to drop slightly as Walter read. Not literally, but in the way rooms change when something true enters them after a long absence. The codicil then modified the disposition of the primary estate assets significantly. The commercial properties were to be placed into a managed trust with Aunt Sola named as the sole trustee, her quiet steadiness apparently observed and valued by my grandfather in exactly the way I had always suspected. The farmhouse and its 12 acres were to be transferred to me directly and without condition. Cornelius received a single provision. A letter from his father. Personal and private, to be delivered sealed. Nothing else. Walter finished reading and set the pages down. The silence that followed was the kind that has weight and texture. Uncle Pax stared at the table. Uncle Bryce looked at the window. Aunt Vera had her arms folded tightly across her chest. Aunt Sola looked at Kofi Mensah across the table. Kofi looked back at her. Something passed between them that looked like recognition. My father stood up. Not dramatically. Just the slow, careful rising of a man who needed to be vertical in order to feel like he still controlled something in the room. "This is not valid," he said. His voice was measured, but I could hear the effort that measurement was costing him. A document held by a former employee for 7 years with no chain of custody verification cannot simply be introduced at a reading and accepted without challenge. Walter Obie looked at him with the patience of someone who had anticipated this exact response. "The chain of custody is fully documented," he said. "Mr. Mensah signed a formal custodial agreement with this office 7 years ago. The document has been logged in our sealed record since that date." Mr. Mensah held a witnessed copy. This office held the original. He paused. "Your father was thorough, Cornelius." My father looked at Kofi. It was not a look I wanted to hold in my memory, but I did anyway because some things need to be witnessed clearly even when they are uncomfortable. It was the look of a man confronting the consequence of something he had done a long time ago and never fully reckoned with. Kofi met the look without flinching. Without anger. Without satisfaction. Just the steady open expression of a man who had carried something heavy for a long time and had finally set it down in the right place. "You fired me because I found the account," Kofi said quietly. Not accusingly. Just as a statement of fact placed gently into the record. My father said nothing. Walter gathered the papers. "I'd suggest we allow the process to continue," he said. The remainder of the reading took 40 minutes. Walter moved through every provision with the same unhurried precision he had maintained throughout. Aunt Sola accepted the trustee appointment with a single nod and no visible surprise, as though she had been quietly prepared for the weight of it and had already decided she could carry it. My father sat back down after Walter's response to his objection and did not speak again for the rest of the session. He held the sealed letter. Walter eventually slid across the table with both hands and looked at it for a long time without opening it. Whatever Celeste Abara had written to his eldest son was private, and I did not need to know its contents. The codicil had already said the essential thing. Kofi approached me after Walter formally closed the reading, and people began gathering their things in the particular quiet of a room that has witnessed something significant and has not yet found its normal register again. He was shorter than I remembered, the way people from childhood always recalibrate in adult memory, but his handshake was firm and warm and exactly right. He talked about you often, Kofi said. Right until the end. He left me his desk, I said. Kofi smiled. He said you were the only one who actually sat in it, he replied. He said you understood that some things have to be felt from the inside before you can understand what they're holding. I thought about sitting in that chair on the first evening. Finding the photograph. Feeling something I could not name. He knew I would find it, I said. He knew, Kofi said simply. That was always his way. I drove to the farmhouse alone that afternoon. Nobody suggested coming with me, and I did not invite anyone. Some moments require solitude the way some conversations require silence. The gravel drive was exactly as I remembered it from childhood summers. The oak trees on either side had grown fuller, their branches closer to touching overhead than they used to be. The farmhouse itself sat at the end of the drive looking exactly like itself, unhurried and solid, the way things built with genuine intention tend to look across decades. I sat on the porch steps for a long time before going inside. I thought about my grandfather writing in that journal for 11 years, documenting what he saw without bitterness, protecting what he had built without cruelty, trusting Kofi with the most important document he would ever sign because Kofi had proven the only thing that actually mattered in the end. That he was the kind of person who brought the truth forward even when the cost was significant. I thought about what it meant that my grandfather had left me this place. Not the eldest child. Not the most ambitious one. The granddaughter who asked why when she was 14 and kept asking quietly for 20 years. I pulled out the photograph from my jacket pocket. My grandfather laughing outside this exact house. Kofi beside him. Both of them lit by afternoon light that had come and gone and somehow still felt present. On the back, those 4 words. Kofi knows the rest. Now I knew it too. All of it. The patience required to let truth arrive in its own time. The courage required to keep records when the people around you preferred comfortable silence. The particular strength of a person who builds something real and then trusts the right people to protect it. My grandfather used to say the truth was never in a hurry. Standing at the door of the farmhouse that was now mine, I finally understood he had not been talking about waiting. He had been talking about building something worth arriving to. I opened the door and went inside.